Hello, Internet. Hello, world. We are here to talk about emotional safety in games and calibration and intensity. Um, and we have several special guests. This is the Game to Grow webisode uh, that focuses on emotional play and how it can potentially be transformative. Uh, the vast majority of us focus on tabletop and LARP, so you're going to be hearing a lot about that. But certainly a lot of the things we're talking about could be transmittable to other communities as well. So let's go ahead and introduce ourselves. I'm Sarah Lynne Bowman. I am a LARP scholar and designer, and I am very passionate about this topic. I write a lot about the topic of bleed, which is when emotions transfer into the frame of the game from outside and back and forth. And I'm very interested in preserving emotional safety, establishing emotional safety in communities. So next we have Maury Brown. Maury, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Maury, as Sarah said, and I am a LARP designer and LARP scholar as well. I'm the co-lead designer for New World Magiscola here in the U.S., and I write about empathy, finding empathy and community building in games, and also gender roles in games particularly.
Fantastic. All right. And next we have Lizzie Stark. Lizzie, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi, I'm Lizzie. I'm a journalist, and I got into LARP maybe 8 years ago while I was reporting for my book, which is called Leaving Mundania. It's a narrative nonfiction exploration of LARP. And then I became so enamored of the community that I've stuck around. And I do some LARP design for my own pleasure as well as for some institutions.
Wonderful. Thank you. And next we have John Stavropoulos. John, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. So as Sarah said, my name is John Stavropoulos. I work as a system designer, specifically director of product and design for a company that produces software for the Department of Child Services. So we focus on investigation reporting and ongoing services, utilizing systems that focus on limiting trauma. So the issue of safety is one that's very, very important to me. Additionally, in gaming, I used to run Nerd NYC, which was a community in New York City. For over 1,000 people, I've run over 26 gaming conventions, as well as writing safety tools, code of conducts for various gaming conventions, including Gen Con. I'm happy to be here.
Awesome. Thanks, John. And last but not least, we have Johanna Koljonen. Johanna?
Hi. I'm joining you from Malmö, Sweden, so I think I'm the farthest away on average from most of you guys. I have a Nordic LARP background since I'm from the Nordic countries, Finland originally, and then Sweden and Denmark in different orders. I'm an experienced designer. I'm also a writer and do some other things professionally. And for the last 5 years, I've had this weird obsession or quest to figure out what my community, which is the sort of Nordic LARP community in its widest sense, knows about designing what we used to call safety in LARP. Now we like to talk about safety and calibration as different things, which we're going to return to. And the more I learn about this, the more I realize that we've been talking about this with very blunt tools. So it's a lot about figuring out the theory of participation safety for me. And I have a blog, or actually I'm writing a book, but very, very slowly. So currently it's just a blog, and you can find it's called Safety in LARP, and you can find it on participationsafety.wordpress.com. And right now, what's most exciting to me is the idea of communities as an object of design. And weirdly, I find that very useful in my professional work, whether I'm consulting with museums or cinemas or digital games companies. A lot of different spheres are dealing with this idea of bringing participation into their work. And that involves building communities, and how do you actually do that? And it turns out that the role-playing community has a lot to offer, a lot of tools that we can use for these things as well.
Absolutely. And we also would benefit from learning from other communities that have done a lot of this work, because it seems like we do a lot of reinventing the wheel, unfortunately, when it comes to a lot of these topics. They come up in many different communities. Um, so, awesome. Thank you. So the first question, we all are here in part because we think that it is beneficial to play emotionally intense scenarios, emotionally intense content. Not everybody feels that way, and that's valid to acknowledge. Some people like to role play or play games for what they consider escapism or entertainment or fun, and this is not at all to invalidate their experience of games, which is valid for them. But I think for all of us, we've had some emotionally intense experiences in games, and those have been very powerful. So I would like to pose the question to each of you. Um, why is it beneficial to engage in emotionally intense play? And Johanna, we'll start with you.
I almost wish you hadn't started with me, because I come from this tradition where emotionally intense or engaging topics are completely normalized and mainstream in both of our freeform and even tabletop scenarios, and also, of course, in LARP. So I find this question a little strange. I mean, can it be beneficial? Yes, absolutely. But also, it's quite interesting. So I want to approach it from the sort of perspective of also just like to begin with the part of it that is actually about entertainment, and say that entertainment can be something serious and meaningful. There are stories that can be told, whether it's The Godfather or I don't know, a German art movie about revolutionaries that you can engage with, and it can be formally entertaining while also making you as a participant in role-playing games or as a viewer in cinema engage with some really serious issues through these stories and through the empathy that fiction allows and provides. And of course that empathy is stronger in role-playing games because of the embodiment aspect that is necessary there. So I almost want to say that even if it weren't beneficial, I think that we need to, we should embrace it anyway. However, I also think that it has this enormous educational potential, and I have a billion examples from my own LARPing background, but I'll just mention one, which is a Norwegian LARP called Europa, which was about the refugee crisis after the war in the Balkans, and they had created this is 15 years ago, they created a LARP that was set in a parallel history where that war had taken place in Scandinavia, and different Nordics were seeking refuge in a fictional country called, or seeking asylum in a fictional country called Orsinia. And we spent 4 days in a real world, in something that was very close approximation of a real world asylum center, waiting for our decisions to whether we would get asylum or not. And in Norway at that time, the waiting time for that decision was, I think, about 4 months, which was considered terrible. And we know that in the refugee crisis that Europe is facing today, people will wait for years before knowing whether they will be allowed to stay or not, or whether they will be returned to this terrible, to these countries where these terrible crises are happening. And of course, I don't know what it's like to be a refugee from having played this LARP. However, I have a much more real understanding of what that waiting entails, because even just pretending to wait for 4 days for that answer was such an intense experience. And I can't, I can't swipe by those news items. I can't not engage with that reality, because I have some inkling of what it's like. And that, I think, has been a life-changing experience for me.
Awesome. Thank you very much. John, same question to you. Why do you think it's beneficial to engage in emotionally intense play?
Cool. So I think I'm going to talk about this a little bit in a larger context, not just gaming conferences and gaming events and gaming games themselves. I go to a lot of academic conferences, a lot of skill-sharing conferences, a lot of networking conferences, and I find that more and more these conferences are utilizing techniques and skills from games, from LARPs, from gaming conventions. And I've been noticing patterns that I see again and again. And The thing I would say is most beneficial from my perspective in engaging emotional intense play is that it's a bonding experience. It helps you bond with other people. It helps you form friendships very quickly. That lasts a surprisingly long time. And so one thing I notice is a lot of networking events I go to, there seem to be filled with people who are just after college, right? So they're either looking for jobs or they live in a new city or a new location, and they may not know as many people, right? They don't have their school experience where you're kind of forced to socialize. They might be away from their families. The other kinds of folks that I see coming to these events are people who are a little bit older, have had children, and their children are now at a certain age in which they can kind of fend for themselves. So now they have a little bit more free time and can connect with more people. But they may not have easy avenues for making friends, for making these strong bonds. So I've been noticing a lot of the networking events that I go to, they feel very similar to gaming events in that you do these intense experiences, often in character. Like this is now increasingly a thing. I do think that a lot of these conferences are looking at what folks are doing in the various Nordic countries as far as EduLARP and stealing everything they can. I don't think any of this is a coincidence, personally. That said, you know, I keep watching this amazing thing that almost feels like, this is going to sound bad, but it almost feels like watching a horror movie, right? Where so you're watching this a horror movie and you're getting it intensely engaged, right? Your heart rate is going up, your blood pressure is rising slightly, your respiration is going a little fast, and you're really, really like feeling what's happening. You're really emotionally connected to everything around you. And then I've been reading a lot of psychological studies talking about the excitation transfer process. Right, so there's this study, this idea that after you have these very intense experiences, afterwards your blood pressure goes down, your heart rate goes down, your respiration goes down, but your arousal lingers. You have these very positive emotions that are intensified, and that allows bonding to happen very quickly with those around you. I personally also feel that I'm quite extroverted, so I know going to these events that are very emotionally intense gives me a lot of positive energy, so I feel really, really great from that. I also feel like I personally am very empathic. So when I'm around other people who are feeling very emotional experiences, usually positive, I don't want to get overwhelmed with too much negativity per se. I will feel like I bond with them, relate to them, understand them, but also I myself feel very energized. That said, I do want to, this should be obvious, but I do want to emphasize that obviously these sort of experiences aren't for everyone. For example, not everyone loves roller coaster rides.
Awesome. And just to clarify, when you say arousal, you're not necessarily talking about sexual arousal, but you're talking about arousal in the psychological sense of feeling engaged. Is that
exactly.
Right?
Yes.
Awesome. All right. So next we have Lizzie. So why is it beneficial to engage in emotionally intense play?
So I'd like to talk about it from an artistic perspective. Namely, the essence of being human is experiencing emotion, is experiencing feeling. And I think that there is utility in experiencing as full a range of emotions as you possibly can. And I think that these emotions create empathy between people, a bit about what Johanna was talking about, feeling empathy with the refugees. And I think that is I think anything that helps us to understand each other and connect with one another better is inherently beneficial. I also think there can be moments of catharsis that happen through these intense emotions that get roused when you're playing a game that's very serious. There are ways you can process, for example, grief in a way that doesn't necessarily touch on your own grief, and I think there's utility in that as well. So I would kind of say it makes us more human. It helps us have empathy for other humans, which is good. It provides catharsis, and then beyond that, it's just fun. Sometimes people like watching really sad movies because they need a good cry, and I think there's an aspect to emotionally intense LARP that is the same, whether the emotion is sadness or fear or extreme joy.
Awesome. And if you don't mind, can I ask you a follow-up about your scenario, The Curse, and why you think that might be a potentially cathartic scenario to play?
Yeah, so my scenario, The Curse, is a game that I wrote sort of based on my memoir, Pandora's DNA. I was challenging myself to try to tell the story that I tell in the memoir, but to tell it in game form, because I think games are just a medium for storytelling. LARP is just a medium for storytelling. So in this game, you play two sisters who have a BRCA mutation, a BRCA mutation, running in the family that dramatically ups their risk of developing breast and ovarian cancer. And over the course of the LARP, you play these women and their partners, and you have to decide. The older sister has to decide whether she's going to have her ovaries out, and the younger sister has to decide what to do with the test information that's positive. And for me, it was important to write this scenario because I thought that people were getting a little judgy. Like people in the media were getting a bit judgy about women who were choosing to have a preventative mastectomy. But there are a lot of external, sort of unseen external forces acting on these women. When you come from a long family history of, of people in your family sickening and dying of breast cancer, that legacy really hangs over your head. So I did it for a couple of reasons. I mean, I wanted to show that it's more complex than it was often portrayed in the media, especially around, Angelina Jolie's mastectomy for the same condition. If I had a nickel for every time somebody said, are more women going to be having unnecessary mastectomies because Angelina Jolie made it cool, like I'd be a millionaire. And the other reason is that I wanted to sort of test my own rationality, kind of, or I wanted to test my own decision-making process by watching other people sort of given the same set of starting conditions, would they make the same choices I made, and why or why not? So that was an interesting experiment. That was an interesting experiment for me. So I got something out of it. I got, I had my curiosity satisfied.
So it sounds like another element of this is that playing out this content allows us to sort of deal with decision making and in a relatively safe atmosphere, and we'll get into that issue of safety.
Yeah, exactly. And you can explore making bad decisions as well as making positive decisions. When you run a simulation, it's very easy to make the choice you're supposed to make, and I think it's quite interesting to explore what happens when you're making deliberately bad choices and how it feels, and does it really feel bad?
Great, thank you so much. All right, Maury, last person. Why do you think it's useful to play emotionally intense material? All right, are we here? Okay, sorry about that. So it sounds like Yoch wanted to mention really quick her experience playing The Curse. If you wanted to just jump in.
Yeah, I could do that. We seem to have lost Maury. I think so. I played The Curse, and I just wanted to say something about my experience with that, which is that the setup for this game tells you quite a lot about this condition, which I wasn't very aware of before, and the whole idea is to try and experience being part of a family where you have this curse, quote unquote, over you, and the kinds of choices where any choice you will make, for instance, will you test to find out whether you have this gene or not, is going to be it's going to have positive consequences as well as negative consequences, because one, for instance, is that of course, that what does that knowledge give you? Then you will know that you have this heightened risk of cancer. It doesn't mean that you will actually necessarily develop cancer. It just means that it's super likely for that to happen, and so on. And I felt when I played that game that the more at the beginning, I had this weird journey. At the beginning, when I learned about BRCA, I felt like, okay, I know what the right answer is. Like, I've figured it out. For instance, if my child would have a 50% chance of having this very fatal condition, why then I thought, of course, I wouldn't have a biological child, and of course I wouldn't, like, of course my character is going to choose not to have a biological child. And while I played the LARP, I realized that and the LARP, one of the things that it portrays so beautifully, and I'm sorry, Liz, like, I don't know if we've ever spoken about this, one of the things that it portrays so beautifully is the thing that when you live with something like that, that's actually going to shape who you are, and many of the qualities, for instance, really, I mean, if you have a risk of dying young, you're going to really go for your dreams, for instance. And that if that shapes who you are, is that something that you would unchoose? And before, and I think maybe this LARP is what, like 4 hours or something like that, and by the end of it, I had realized that in my family, we have bipolar disorder, many of us, and it's very clear, like, I'm not ill, I've been very lucky, but it's very, very clear for anybody who knows me that I'm on that spectrum as well. I'm clearly carrying these genes. And that's a relatively dangerous disease. It has a high mortality, about 10% as well. And suddenly, during playing this LARP, which isn't even about that illness, I was like, oh, hang on, like, I am also carrying a dangerous genetic defect, and I would never choose to not have children based on that, because everyone I love the most, everything about them that I love the most, is probably an effect of this genetic cocktail. And it was an enormous insight that I had never asked for or ever sort of invited or reflected on, and I'm very, very happy that I started that thought process years and years before any kind of discussion about potentially having children. And it was also, and as you say, it was safe. It was a safe way to engage with it, because it wasn't about, like, that LARP's not about me, and it's not about bipolar disorder, it's not about my family in any way, but it made me think about those things in a way that I wouldn't have allowed myself to do, probably, otherwise.
Yeah, I'll just jump in to say that, from my point of view, it's that LARP, of course, it's about my family, it's about BRCA, but it's also about the human condition of living in uncertain circumstances where the consequences of the choices that you make are not clear, or it's not crystal what the right choice is, because there's so much uncertainty around even like the science. So that to me was one of the things I really wanted to explore in that game, was living with uncertainty, and sort of how that the uncertainty itself can drive you to make choices in kind of non-obvious ways.
That's a really good point. I think that a lot of these games, even if they're specifically dealing with a certain subject matter, can also speak to the human experience in other ways as well. And so even if we don't have personal experience with that particular topic, it may make us relate in other ways that we didn't even realize were connected. Awesome. So it looks like we have Maury had to step out. Hopefully she will come back. But John, I was wondering if you wanted to share an emotionally intense game that you've designed or played that is like a sterling example for you.
So I feel like I don't know if I would call these games or as much as like workshop exercises, but I've played exercises where you have a character, right, and you're put in a scenario. So they're effectively games like. And so I've done in Living Games, for example, when we did our crisis management workshops, what we did is we create scenarios in character. You portray different characters where some sort of crisis occurs. It could be harassment, it could be someone in danger, it could be any level of challenge that a bunch of organizers may need to address and deal with and step up and resolve. And so that for me was very emotionally intense, but I would say that it was even more intense to see other people's reactions playing it, because a lot of the people that we engage with are people who talk about these things online all the time, right? So they care about these topics, right? They care about harassment. They want people to be safe. They have strong opinions about what they would do in a situation if it arose where they were in charge. Fortunately and unfortunately, many of these folks aren't in those situations, aren't in those positions, haven't lived those experiences, right? So all of it's very hypothetical, and it's really easy to make a decision when you're not emotionally connected to what's happening, when there are no stakes. And so going through the crisis management workshop, for me, that was very emotionally intense to watch other people actually imagine being in that situation where they're in charge, things are at stake for them, someone's in danger, they have to take some sort of action. And sometimes that action isn't very clear, right? What they assumed was easy. Actually, it's funny, this is kind of like Johanna's story here, right? They come in with a certain assumption about, of course, this is what I would do, right? And then they're in this situation, have a character, emotionally invested, reflecting on how this situation connects with them personally, and then all of a sudden things are far more complicated and their empathy increases. So to literally watch people, and we did that with like 20 plus people, right? So to watch all these different people's faces change slowly in the course of just like 10, 20, 30 minutes, and to see where they started and where they ended, that was very, very intense. And I felt overall in the debriefs that we did, everyone just kept saying again and again how they felt that their empathy was increased. And that was something that I thought was very beautiful.
It was very beautiful, and I think that it also demonstrated how difficult these situations really are when you're in the middle of them. You may think the answers are easy, but once you're playing it out, it's whoa. Maury came in just in time, so sorry to interrupt earlier. I hope internet is working better for you now. Why do you think it's beneficial to play emotionally intense material?
Well, I would argue that anything can be emotionally intense, and that the idea of playing fluffy, light, escapist, or more rational things might be a false dichotomy, that we sort of have a sense in the Western society where we try to compartmentalize our emotions and we try to minimize them in many ways, and a lot of times our emotions are always there under the surface and can surprise you at any time. And so you can be playing what may seem to be a lighthearted game and suddenly find yourself in an emotionally intense moment, and that's not necessarily bad. But because of our Enlightenment philosophy, where we tend to privilege reason over emotion, a lot of times we say that being in the throes of something emotionally intense is somehow some sort of weakness, but it's, as others have said, it's such a part of being human. And often when we find ourselves in emotionally intense moments, we don't know how to actually regulate them ourselves, because we haven't had a lot of practice, because we've either been told not to feel, or we've repressed the emotions, or we are surprised by them and don't have tools for how to do it. And so one of the things that playing any game, I would argue, can become an emotionally intense experience. And that doesn't necessarily mean negative emotions. It can be incredibly joyful. And you can be surprised and overcome by feelings of absolute elation, or feelings of love, or feelings of just joy, and those too can be so intense and powerful. And so when a lot of times we think about emotionally intense, we're thinking about sadness or what sometimes get termed as negative emotions, but it's an entire spectrum of emotions. And so for me, I would say life is emotionally intense, and so games are A, part of life, and B, mimic life. And so games should be emotionally intense and help us to learn how to process and deal with emotions as they arise, because they will.
Very true. And in some senses, the use of the word game is a little loose here. Oftentimes there aren't win conditions to the games that we're talking about, in the sense of, I win this conflict or whatnot. But there can be. Emotionally intense experiences are not relegated to any particular genre of game or style.
Can I say about that, like, it's actually even, in the tradition that I come from, there is never win conditions like that. That's just not something that happens in the kinds of role-playing games that I play. Like, the win condition is, did we manage to create together a satisfying narrative where ideally, like if we win, we only win if everybody wins. And the way everybody wins is that all of the characters had an interesting narrative. Like all of the characters were the center of their own journey, whether tragic or comedic in the sort of classical sense, where like if you have a happy ending or a sad ending, that's not the point. Like both of those can be equally as awesome. And typically in the same LARP, some characters will have a happy ending and some will have an unhappy ending, and everybody will come out and be like, "Ooh, that was great," you know. But I'd also like to tag on to what Maury was just saying, that because I spent like literally 5 years talking to a lot of people in the Nordic community about, and the sort of extended Nordic communities also from different places in Europe and the States about these strong emotional experiences relative to games, relative to LARPs, and I find that even with people who are, I mean, there are players, there are some small subset of players who are bleed hunters, like who really go in for playing the most intense games, to have the most intense emotional experiences, and to put themselves in real difficult situations, either because that puts some perspective on some real situations, difficult situations in their real life, or more typically because they have lived very sheltered lives and they want to engage with like what the world is like for most people. And what those people say is that quite often the hardest LARPs, like the most difficult topics, aren't actually the ones that you end up having the most bleed from, because it might be like you go to New World Magiscola and you experience like a beautiful friendship or belonging or like a love story of a nostalgic kind or something like that, and then that, you know, resonates with something in your life that you've either experienced or yearned for, and that's the thing that's going to break you, in the sense of like you're going to have some serious feels about it. But that's not a bad thing, like that's a good thing, but that's the one that you're most unprepared for, I think. Like if you play a LARP about the AIDS crisis, or about refugee situations, or about torture in wartime, or about occupation, of course you're prepared, and you build a lot of frameworks for like protecting yourself as well as a player, and to think about doing this in a dignified manner. But you don't think if you're going to do something cheerful that might actually be like, you know, emotionally engaging as well.
That's a really good point. Personally, playing New World Magiscola, I was not expecting to have 3 weeks of bleed around my 20-year-old emotional angst, but I should have been, being that I studied these things. Which is a convenient segue, because I was going to ask Maury to share about her personally emotionally intense a game that you think would be a great example. Of course, we would love you to talk about New World Magiscola, but if you'd rather talk about something that you've been more, you know, engaged as a player with, that would be awesome.
Okay, well, I'll do a little bit of both. You know, New World Magiscola was sort of is designed to have this emotionally intense undercurrent that it isn't on the nose. So it is, as Johanna was talking about, you can come in and you're not going into a LARP where you feel like, oh, I'm definitely going to have an emotionally intense experience. But we know, as John was saying, that when you get people together and they're bonding and they're working together and forming relationships and trust, that the emotional experiences are going to happen. And some of the things can be designed in there to set up specific kinds of conflicts so that people can explore those emotionally intense things in a safer way. And allegory is one of the ways that you can do that in fiction and in LARP design. And so so New World Magiscola has some of that built in, with privilege between different kinds of shapeshifters, or between laws and unjust laws in the community, and things that parallel but do not exactly replicate things that people come across in their everyday life. And they then become, sometimes they don't realize until after, right? And this is what happens in strong educational experiences too, is that, you know, how many times have you maybe sat through a class and said, why am I learning this? What am I doing? Why am I going through this? And then a day later, a week later, or years later, I've had a phone call from a student 5 years later who finally said, I actually finally get their eyes were watching God now, because he caught up in his life experience to something that he remembered from reading and experiencing Janie's experience in that book. And so that's sort of the other thing about emotionally intense experiences is that they aren't in isolation. And so you may have one come up in a game that connects to something from your past or also then something in the future. I played a game at Intercon called Critical Path that made me mad. It made me so angry, and because I had no agency in this game, and this game was designed this way to not have any agency, and I knew it going in, right? And every time that the bell would ring and it would be time to turn the card over and I had to do whatever it said that I was supposed to do, I would just got madder and madder and madder until when the game was over, I was just furious, right? And I thought about it for days, right? And then I'm like, okay, this was a good game, right? Because it affected me and it made me think about agency and choices and how it feels to not have them, and how it felt when you were dealing with the other players who were also in similarly constricted circumstances. And as much as we like to think about it, our choices are always constricted in life by outside norms and institutions and morals and resources and other things. And so it ended up being a really good exploration for me. But my initial feeling was just frustration and anger that then, through being processed, helped me realize how much I learned and felt and how much more complex that was.
All right, and just for people back home who may not know about these games, New World Magischola is a wizard LARP that is run in Virginia and also in Ohio. And Maury, if you could just give us a one-sentence description of Critical Path.
Critical Path was essentially you were on a spaceship that had a malfunctioning drive, and it caused you to go back in time to different points in your life where you got information that changed the direction that you went, and then you came back to the present, and it happened over and over again.
All right, awesome. Okay, so let's kind of transition to the next segment. As Johanna mentioned, the issues of calibration and safety are kind of closely linked, so a lot of the material will probably spill over between these two sections. But we wanted to kind of tease out the difference between what it means to calibrate play between people within a group, meaning finding that sort of happy medium where everybody's play styles are in sync and where everybody sort of understands the game that they're playing and they're all trying to kind of go for the same creative agenda, if we want to use that loaded term. And so I kind of wanted to ask each of you what you think about by the term calibration, and any tips or techniques that you have for trying to get everybody feeling like they have a sense of trust within the group and that they can sort of align with each other's play styles. So we'll go in reverse order, so we'll start again with Maury.
Well, okay, goodness. I feel like I'm doing so much talking now. And it's so strange because Johanna's the one who coined the term calibration. So, you know, the issue for me between calibration and safety, they're two sides of the coin, and I guess I would argue that I would agree with Johanna that it's hard to try to decide which term to use when and where, but I guess the thing I'll offer about calibration to start with is communication, communication of expectations and iterative communication of expectations, and having being able to be nimble and agile to make changes so that the design isn't so structured that you can't make those changes. But I'd like to point out something that Ben had said as we were dealing with New World Magischola that has to do with calibration. And that is, in order to effectively calibrate, the people need to hear what it is you're saying and understand what it is you're saying. And if what you are saying is so strange or foreign to them and their current experience, it doesn't go in. And so one of the things that we had with New World Magic School is we kept trying to tell people that how the play would be, and that also that it would be emotionally intense. And they didn't believe us. And they couldn't believe us because they had just never had any context or experience to put that in, or their experience was actually the direct opposite of it. And so it came down to, you just have to come and be here, right? And feel it and try it and then go on. And then afterwards people would say, oh, now I understand what you're saying, or oh, now I get it. But they were so incredulous. So it can be really difficult to manage expectations and to try to calibrate a community, even though you need to before play and even during play, when people's experiences are either zero or counter to what it is. And there's such a wide variety of where people are coming from, which is part of what you were just getting at, and those needs are very different. The person who's never LARPed before, needs are very different from the person who's LARPed for 20 years but in a different style and has a different background. And so in some cases those can be in direct conflict, and so by giving the new LARPer what they need, it's actually problematic, even more problematic for the thing. And then the second thing I would say is that there are people who actually will sabotage your calibration efforts. Not necessarily maliciously or vindictively, but simply because of disbelief and muscle memory, for lack of a better term. So I'll just kind of leave those things hanging out there for the rest of you all to think about.
Awesome, thank you. All right, so Lizzie, what does calibration mean to you?
So, yeah, so calibration, so I think there are some interesting issues around calibration. In order to really get the job done of having people create a shared vision for something, I think there are a couple different tactics and techniques you can use. One is to kind of highlight the fact that this is an opt-in experience, or that this is an experience that you select yourself into. If you start out with people, I mean, there's a big design challenge. If you have a LARP of 20 and everybody comes in with a vision for the game, right, it's going to be really hard to get them to agree on something that will be satisfying for everybody. But if you are very open about what the experience is like, right, then it's easier. Then you're starting out with a narrower range of expectations, and it's easier to satisfy them. But there's this problem, which, as Maury pointed out, right, which is you tell people it's going to be emotionally intense and they just don't believe you. And because of that, you know, I mean, there are techniques you can use, right? You can workshop people to make them more sensitive to each other's boundaries. You can workshop people to have a culture of negotiation when they're going into intense play, and that's really vital. But it's equally vital to have tools that will let people manage manage the situation when their differing expectations clash with one another, right? So if I really want to play a love-torn story with Sarah, and Sarah is really mostly interested in playing on the business relationship, that's the kind of thing that could create a problem, right? And so we need negotiation tools to help us come to middle ground, but we also need tools to let people opt out, and we need you know, resources where if we can't successfully negotiate among ourselves, we need to be able to appeal to a third party in a way that's healthy and reasonable. So for me, it's those two powers combined, right? Being really clear about what this experience is about and letting people choose to opt in, so that people who don't actually want to play a game about cancer don't show up to the game, and then creating an atmosphere that provides community context, which you can do easily through, not easily necessarily, but which you can do through workshop building. So like when I run games, I like to have people, maybe if they feel comfortable, share a bit about themselves. I like to do group motion, because group motion is very bonding and can help sensitize you to the boundaries of other people. and so on. And of course, and of course transparency, right? That's the thing that allows you to opt into something accurately, right? I don't surprise you with like cancer in the third act, or I don't surprise you with race. Like, this is a game about racism in the third act. I let you know that from the beginning, so you can choose your own adventure.
Awesome, thank you. All right, John, what do you think about calibration?
Cool. Let me. I'm going to tell a story where I saw how important this can be, right? And so I had a group of people that we would get together regularly to play games. I'd say we probably got together maybe 14, 15 times. There were 5 of us in total, and we were having an excellent time. And someone that a few of us knew in common had reached out to us and said, "Hey, I'd be interested in joining you all to play this game." So very common, very simple scenario. So we all got together, and I brought up the topic with everyone, saying, "Hey, would you all be comfortable with this person joining us? If you're not, totally cool. If you are, awesome." And I paused, let people think about it, talk about it, and then everyone just turned around and said, "Yeah, of course. Let them join the game. That sounds great." I'm like, "Cool." But then the next day, I felt strange about it. And I was like, were they being honest with me? Like, is this actually, were they being honest with each other? Like, I have no idea, right? Because when we talk about when we talk about calibration, you're talking about advocating for your needs, and you're also talking about compromising for other people's needs to some degree. And there's a level of honesty that's required to be able to do that, right? And to know that you are in the right bounds and have a feeling of safety and that you'll be heard, and that your interests will actually be considered, and that it's a safe place to be honest. For whatever reason, those folks did not actually give me accurate information. So what I had done is I emailed all of them privately and said, "Listen, I'm sending you all the same exact email. I'm blind copying you, and I just wanted to confirm that you all were actually okay with this person joining the game." Now, I want to be clear that I myself might not be okay with this person joining the game. So if we end up deciding we're not going to play with this person, maybe it was none of you, maybe it was me who decided this. But either way, it'll be anonymous. Just let me know. There's no pressure, and really, we're happy to keep things going the way it is right now. And then half the people wrote to me and said, "Absolutely not. I do not want this person in the game. I don't want to play with them. They would ruin my time. It would ruin the game. I might even stop coming." So it's kind of shocking, and but also pretty normal from my experiences. As I mentioned earlier, I've run many conventions, and a habit, a standard technique that we would follow at the end of a convention is to survey people, right? So we would often survey people. They can either enter in their information anonymously, they can write in who they are, whatever they're comfortable with. But often I would keep track of what people would tell me before they filled out a survey, and then what they would say in the survey itself afterwards if they chose to include their name. And almost all the time it was very, very different, right? So for me, you need to create this situation where people are comfortable for advocating for themselves, to be honest, because is it really truly a negotiation, right? If someone just says yes to anything you say, have they really truly enthusiastically consented? And the other thing is, it's very cultural, right? So depending on who's involved in these negotiations, is someone trained to always just say yes? Is someone trained to always take everything they can, no matter who it hurts? There are people who are like that, and in different situations, when they're negotiating, you're going to take that into account. So for me, that's why I think bringing in calibration techniques is critical, because you're going to be dealing with those constraints, with those realities.
Awesome points. And it is worth it to note that adding new people into any sort of dynamic, whether especially tabletop because it's such a small group, but freeform certainly, and even in a larger group, will affect those dynamics, and then you have to kind of recalibrate with the new person, which can be easy or hard depending on the situation, as John mentioned. All right, Johanna, bring us home.
So I'd like to first recap on some things that you've said. So about this difficulty of communicating and this difficulty of communicating honestly. And I think that and the difficulty of hearing as well. So one one part of that is quite practical. We don't have, like, these words that we use are quite imprecise. And we use terms in role-playing very broadly to mean all kinds of things. And of course, every local community will assume, and every player group and every individual will assume that since they know exactly what they mean by some word, that everybody else, that's what it means. In my experience, communicating with LARPers from 20 plus countries, that is absolutely not the case. And you have to go into some very nitty-gritty nuanced things to be able to figure out what people are actually talking about. So we're at a point where we need more words. That's one thing. The other is that because of this problem, I think that workshopping, which can be all kinds of things, but basically before you start playing, you have your players physically somewhere. And that's when you're going to practice some skills that you need. Like, what are these skills that I will need to play this LARP that's going to happen, or this session that's going to happen? And then you practice them together physically. You say the words and you do the deeds and you practice the things, because you can read it on the page and everybody will have a different understanding of it, and that's not going to work. So you have to do it in the room. You can save a lot of time by also explaining to people beforehand, and because of this transparency reason that everybody's been talking about as well, especially Lizzie. I mean, I think that's very important. People need to know that we're going to have, like, this will be about cancer and it will involve touching or whatever it is. But knowing that in theory, that can help you to opt out. But once you're there, you still need to learn what that actually means. Like, what kind of touching or what kind of engagements with this topic are we going to do? And that's what the sort of workshop is for. You can also use workshop for completely different purposes, like communicating content of the scenario, for instance, but that's a different thing. Again, it's a word that means many things. So I'd like to take a moment to just go back to calibration, like the history of the term, because it's very, very recent, and I came up with it. I can't take credit for the word itself, but I can take credit for the concept. So after literally 5 years of thinking about safety, I was feeling that it was becoming completely unwieldy. Like, because we were using this term to mean so many different kinds of things and mechanics that we were using for so many different purposes that it was literally impossible to talk about them. You couldn't judge them as a group. People would be like, safety is not important, or safety is everything. The words had stopped meaning anything. And I said, surely we have to be able to separate those things that are not about safety, as in those things that are not about dangers, all of the negotiations that we do that are not about protecting ourselves from harm, but that are about protecting ourselves from sort of hurt or like just protecting our experience and keeping it awesome. Like, that needs some other word. And then I spoke to a lot of smart people, and Christopher Turo is the guy who listened to my description, very long description about what this should be. And then he said, oh, you mean calibration? And I was like, yes. Thank God, yes, calibration. That is exactly what we're talking about here. So calibration to me is something that's happened, certainly, like the expectation management is what I would call what you were talking about on the sort of community level and on the event level. But calibration to me is what happens between us as 2 players or between maybe 5 players in a situation. When we are figuring out what do we want to play, what can we play in this specific situation, and those are not the same thing typically. And that's why the players need to communicate with each other. And if you're especially if you're in a LARP tradition like I am, where you don't necessarily break play to negotiate at these points, you need tools to be able to do it inside or while the fiction is continuing. You can also absolutely break play, and that's also completely valid. And many of the best tools actually require you to step out and pause the fiction for a very brief while to negotiate, and I'm for that. But sometimes you don't even do that, because we are talking about both implicit calibration and explicit calibration. And then explicit calibration would mean that you invoke some kind of signal or language where very clearly the players are negotiating with each other. But there's also implicit calibration, which we all do all the time to be able to role play with differing agility, I think, but we all do it. So one example is, and it doesn't even have to be about intense things, like maybe we're at a LARP and your group over there has drifted into a sort of comedy tone, and my group over here is playing about something more seriously. And then when we meet, we need to figure out both as characters and as players, how do we make this coherent? Like, how do we engage inside this fiction without the fiction breaking down, without anybody's stories falling to pieces because because it just this LARP happens. This is typically a thing that happens. And what happens there, I would consider implicit calibration, which is where everybody is listening really well and picking up all of these little social cues from each other about like, how do we solve this? So it's a sort of weird like social awkwardness almost in a LARP. And in this way, this is very similar from the real world to the real world, because in the real world, very often we have social awkwardness. Very often you're in a bar or in a classroom, and people have ended up in different genres, and we need to negotiate like how the hell do we engage with each other in a non-offensive way. And that's also calibration. So actually people have pretty good skills about this, about how to handle this. But then there are some specific things that are activated in the LARP setting. Like, for instance, like one of the things that might happen in a LARP is that maybe my group are not going to kill you guys. And that wouldn't typically happen in a classroom. And then we need to have a different kind of negotiation about whether that's a kind of experience that would be cool for you or not. So we just need some bigger tools to be able to build these kinds of structures. So you can make a LARP with no explicit calibration tools at all, and you can make a role-playing game with no explicit calibration tools, and many of us actually do that all the time. But the price you pay for that design choice, and it's a choice that you can make, but the price you pay for that is that it's not going to be very inclusive. Because if you have a good transparency around it, many people will opt out just in case. Many people would choose not to engage with your LARP because they think probably, maybe, possibly there's going to be some kind of content that they might not be comfortable with, or they can't guarantee, or like maybe you have set the way we simulate violence will be full contact, low impact fighting, for instance. And then I'm going to always opt out of that LARP because I actually, like, I'm not comfortable with that. I'm too clumsy. I'm going to hurt someone, or they're going to hurt me. So I would never play that LARP. There's nothing wrong with the design. It's just not for me. But if you are a business, you will want to be inclusive, and if you have a community inclusion agenda for other purposes, political purposes or social purposes, then you will want your design to be inclusive, and then you need some way of negotiating, and that's when you need the calibration tools to be there. Yes, I made a note finally that I should say that, as you said at the beginning, Sarah, that it is difficult sometimes to see the distinction between what is safety and what is calibration. And that's not necessarily a flaw, that's actually often a feature, because of course we're designers. That means we're invested in the elegance of our designs. If you put in 15 or 20 different tools for different purposes, people will not be able to use them fluidly. There's just too much cognitive demand on them. And LARPing itself, because you have to keep creating the fiction, is a pretty big load. So actually the tools have to be very economical. And I think in a good safety and calibration design, quite often, not always, but very, very often, the same tools, the same gestures or language is used both for safety purposes and for calibration purposes. So it's quite common in different kinds of LARP to have different kinds of traffic light systems, for instance, where you have perhaps safe words to either cut interaction or pause interaction entirely, or to sort of say we're pausing at this level of intensity and we cannot escalate from here, or that or just go. And that can be done with gestures or with language in different ways. And that is, of course, a really good example of something that is both a safety tool and a calibration tool. Like, it can be a safety tool because I'm, for instance, protecting myself from engaging with triggering content. It can be a safety tool because we can use that to stop a physically dangerous situation from escalating or happening even. But it's also a calibration tool because we can use the same language to figure out where we want to be. And with some LARPs, you want to separate those very clearly because you need players to be able to communicate about their comfort separately from the physical safety. And in some LARPs, it's the most elegant solution to use the same tools for both.
Awesome. So as has been mentioned, this is obviously very complicated, and we're trying to put words around things that we just sort of have felt before, which can be very difficult, and we're trying to create tools that hopefully will make the experience better rather than interrupt it so that people feel like they can't engage. So that requires a lot of design and thinking and iteration and sharing really between communities, which we've been doing a lot of, which is really exciting. In thinking about this sort of difference between calibration and safety. It seems like calibration is something that happens to avoid people feeling unsafe in a lot of cases. And in that, if I'm walking into a game thinking I'm playing this awesome love story with Lizzie, and that actually doesn't make her feel very safe, and we don't negotiate that in some way or adjust to each other's play style, that can actually cause a problem. So for this last sort of segment of the talk, I'd like to talk about how we can integrate specific tools into our LARPs and to tabletop games that can allow us to make other players feel more safe, which also conveniently might or might not be calibration tools. So let's start again with Johanna.
Possibly once again the worst person to ask, because I do feel very, very strongly about design, about bespoke systems. So very broadly speaking, now this is a massive generalization. In LARP in America, Russia, Germany, a lot of the sort of big markets, so to speak, LARP design historically has been about figuring out rule systems that can cover every eventuality, like the one rule system to rule them all. The one rule system is going to be 500 pages, but there is nothing that you cannot play in a fair and in a fair and interesting manner with those rules. That is a beautiful goal. It's completely uninteresting to me personally, but I'm intellectually fascinated by this. And it's very important when you play sandbox type campaign games where you want to enable everything to be possible, right? But if you play basically a one-shot focused tradition like the Nordic LARP tradition is, and you play in a collaborative style where nobody's out to win, so fairness is actually becomes irrelevant, then you would have different rules for every LARP you play. And then again, it becomes about the economy of the design, which is like, what does this LARP require for me to be able to play it, or not just for me, but for us as a collective to be able to, for us, the specific players of this specific run of this LARP, what do we need to be able to play it? And that's why I'm never going to give you like an answer like these tools are good to use. But what I can say is that it is a structural thing. Like if you're only looking at the runtime design, or if you're only looking at like what kinds of tools and gestures and language are we using to negotiate while we're in character or while the runtime of the LARP is progressing, then that's not enough. You need to design what happens before and what happens after, because as Maury was saying, like a lot of the learning and a lot of the reflection and a lot of the reactions actually happens after the thing, and a lot of the priming and a lot of the figuring out like where are we, what's our baseline as a community, and how do we trust each other because we don't necessarily know each other, like do we like each other, are we okay touching each other's hands, all of that stuff you have to establish before the playtime starts, or you're going to waste valuable in-game real estate on figuring that out. And then that's going to be like the players. That sounds in a way a little bit of immersion, I think, if you have to do that during the LARP. It's another thing that prevents you from going into the story very strongly. But those things are also relying on the norms of your community. So if your players have mostly the same background, or they come in with very strong ideas of what LARP is or how LARP is played, then you have to engage with that as well. And if they have different backgrounds, it's actually helpful, because then it's easier kind of to communicate, which is like everybody in this room has a different understanding of what LARP is. So we need to sort of try and throw that all out the window and start from scratch and say, what will this LARP be? And I'm just going to do a digital game comparison here, which is really obvious, but I think it needs spelling out, which is every time you open a digital game, that game will teach you. The first thing that happens when you open digital games, it will teach you, how do I play this game? Like, what's going on here? How do I engage with this world? What is my agency? What are my goals? Which buttons do I need to push to do different things? Like, and that's something that we completely take for granted as computer gamers. And I think that it's very helpful if we approach LARP and tabletop as well, and freeform, every kind of role-playing game in the same, analog games in the same way, and say, every time I play a role-playing game is my first time, and that game can tell me, and it can give me the tools that I need, exclusively the tools that I need to do this. And that's what you should do, I say normatively. And now I will let you Americans say, like, no, we can have these norms, and like, go right ahead. But this is where I'm coming from.
Awesome. I'm going to establish a norm right now that actually came from you, which is the look down method, which I think is amazing. We've been using it in New World Magischola. Johanna had blogged about it as a possibility, and it's something that actually has emerged in Planetfall just sort of organically. They do it with a hand on the back of the head. But basically the idea is I can leave a scene just for any reason without anybody following me just by doing this. And also, if I come into a room like this, please don't make a big deal about it. Act like I was here the whole time. And I think that's a really interesting way to sort of seamlessly opt in and out of situations.
I have to say something about this, which is that I know that it's a New World Magischola hack. Basically, like the people have, and I think that people started using this to be able to like arrive late in class without consequences and so on. So to me personally, I think that's terrible. Like, why would you waste an opportunity for role playing? It's like, So, but this is what it is. Like, so tools. But this is a really good example that when you take a tool and apply it to something else, it's going to be used differently, and it's going to be used for whatever the needs of that LARP is. And that's why it's very dangerous when your participants bring tools in that you haven't all decided, like the collective or the organizers. I don't care how you divide that responsibility, but somebody has to decide and communicate which rules are we using and why. Because if some Americans came to my LARP, having used this thing for this, and would now use it to try and like get out of certain situations or like sneak into play, I would not be able to engage with that, because that's not how I had defined that thing to be used. It's a really nice fix if you need that, but actually, like, again, like if you're serious about playing for the most interesting story, being late to class is 100 times more interesting than being in time for class. So I don't see what, like, to me that's a completely redundant mechanic and therefore not elegant. But that just goes to show that my play style and my tradition is different from the American one. Yes. Okay. Now I will be quiet.
But it was extremely useful for example, new LARPers who are afraid to go to class at all because they did not want to be berated in front of the whole class or lose house points and then have their house hate them. So this was a real anxiety concern that solved. So, yes. All right. So John, can you talk to us about perhaps the X card and maybe other techniques that you think are useful for making games more safe for people?
So am I required to talk about the X card, or can I talk about it?
You can opt out of talking about the X card.
Okay, I can do this right now if I want. Okay, excellent. For me, and I'll use some techniques as an example of this, I feel like practice is important, right? So especially in American culture that I've observed, there's this idea of, do you have these rules just to legally limit your liability, or do you have these rules because you actually expect them to be used in play, right? So I see this in conventions all the time where they're like, here's my anti-harassment policy. We haven't actually practiced it or figured out what we're going to do if something goes wrong, but look, don't sue us, so I think you need to get past that, right? So if you're serious and you want people to use this from an American cultural standpoint, you need to prove it to people. You need to say, this isn't just words, this is actually meant to be used, and look, we're going to practice this, and we're going to keep practicing it till it becomes second nature. So let me give an example of that. For a lot of us, there's the mechanic called cut. So if you say cut, you stop everything that's happening and you assess the situation. So if there's an emergency, right, let's say someone's about to trip or someone's going to be hurt or whatever it may be, you're saying it's important that play stops so we can address whatever it is, right? And different events and different games may have different uses of that. So I'm speaking very generally. That said, in a lot of the games that I saw that had that, for whatever reason, when there was workshops to practice that, people wouldn't do it, right? Like I know personally people who have called cut and have used it, but I know other people have mentioned they would have used it but didn't feel comfortable in the moment, right? So that's just something that I was listening to. And one thing I did notice, because whenever I think about system design, I think about designing something that's elegant. Can create a rule around something that we're doing anyway? Like, is it something that we're doing all the time that creates an opportunity for me to insert a rule? And if I can do that, then it feels more natural. So for example, whenever we run events, run games, we'd always use a rule where when you lift your arm up, everyone stops, right? So you lift your arm up, everyone else lifts their arms, they stop talking, and you stop. And then someone gives us instruction or states something or whatever. So in several of our games where it was appropriate, and I'm going to give an example where it was not appropriate, but in a lot of games where it was appropriate, we would combine lifting your hand up with cut, right? So you lift your hand up, everyone stops, and if there's an emergency, someone states it. If it's simply talking about the rules, someone states it. And then all of a sudden, several people that had told me they were uncomfortable using that started feeling comfortable using it, specifically because they saw it in play all the time. Right? They saw this happening quite frequently. That said, to Johanna's point, or to one of her points, we did this in a LARP that involved being in a classroom a lot, not New World Magic School, but a high school game. So in high school, you raise your hand a lot, right? So like you're in class, you're constantly raising your hand, and that was bad. That created a lot of confusion. It was an example where just because you have a rule that might apply in a lot of situations doesn't mean they apply in all situations. So you have to be very careful how you approach that. Cool.
Thanks, John. All right.
Sorry, can I say super fast to that actually this whole gesture was invented by Trina Lise Lindahl because in a hypothetical conversation, because we were talking about there's a LARP called Brudpris, which means the bride price, which is about a super oppressive like patriarchy, and I was talking about that it would be cool to have a fluid opt-out gesture, and I suggested hanging your head and just like walking off, like hanging your head very demonstratively. But I hadn't played the LARP, and they were like, "No, you don't understand. Like all the female characters hang their head all the time, so it's inappropriate." I'm like, okay, you need to enter something else. But of course, like you need to hack it for whatever your needs are.
Thank you, Lizzie.
I have the one safety technique to rule them all. Are you ready for this? You have to have a healthy community. You have to have a good community. If you don't have a healthy community, then none of the other safety techniques will work. So I think that doing good community design is really the bedrock foundation of safety in LARP. You know, if you don't have a culture of respecting safety, if you don't have a culture of respecting people's boundaries, if you don't have a culture of allowing people to be seen, you know, then none of your safety techniques are going to work. And I think there are a lot of things that you can do to facilitate community design. One of them is to make good social practices more visible by making rules around them, and of course. There are many different communities that have a variety of social tools that are very effective, right? One of them is raising your hand to have people get quiet. That just makes speaking up very easy, or the open share rule, right, where you have an open share when you're sitting down and having a conversation, which signifies that anybody is welcome to come and join you, and so on and so forth. Yes. Also, I think healthy communities use negotiation. They respect people's boundaries. They have, you know, they abide by the rule of enthusiastic consent. They're inclusive. I think that in healthy communities there is conflict, because I think conflict management is a skill. Yeah, allowing people to enforce their own boundaries and respect their own boundaries. And I think that when you do game design, you're also designing community. You're designing the community for this very particular game. And so what you do in the workshop or the warm-up is you start modeling some of the behavior that you need people to abide by during the LARP. And this includes making, for most LARPs, I think, making people sensitive to other people's boundaries. Yeah, so for me, the bedrock of good safety design is good community design, and this is also because, you know, in LARP, unexpected things happen all the time. Somebody trips and falls. You know, some random topic comes up that you didn't know was triggering to another person, and there's a psychological safety situation, and it's not easy, as we've talked about earlier in this panel. It's not easy to respond to emergencies in the moment that they happen. it's challenging. And so the more people you have who are able to mount a concerted effort to fix the problem, the more like we're all in this together and we're going to help everybody be safe. We're going to help people manage the issues that come up. The more people you have doing that, the more likely it is that the issue is going to be addressed.
Absolutely, and I think that provides a really nice segue to Maury, because I feel, and I am a little biased having been involved, but I feel like New World Magischola as a game has a lot of a culture of community of care, where people's needs definitely are, for the most part, respected, and a lot of that has to do with expectation setting ahead of time and the briefings, but also with the mechanics that we did integrate into the game to kind of help with calibration and safety. So I was wondering if you wanted to talk about some of those. We already talked about look down, but some of the other ones.
Yes, I do. Thanks. Yes, this is an intentionally designed game to create a community of care. The rhetoric of the game and of the player guide and of the workshops and of all the things is a feminist rhetoric of care, and designed in opposition to more traditional agonistic rhetoric where somebody wins or someone's opinion is more valid than the others, and it's designed to try to bring negotiation. So I wanted to touch, I'll get to the couple of specifics that I know you want to talk about, but I wanted to touch a little bit on what Lizzie and Johanna and John were saying, whereas I would absolutely agree that in order to be able to have safety and calibration techniques, that it's about community design, and these things are all bound up together, and you can't have an enforcer that a lot of people, Johanna brought up, that we had these layers of mechanics and these specific rules, and we had a system where you could go to the game master for arbitration to solve your problem. But when you are looking to be able to have calibration techniques, they need to be pervasive. It can't be that people are coming to a person who will calibrate for them, right? To come to the teacher who will solve the situation on the playground, to come to the game master who will solve the situation for the people. Now, there need to be people to go to in circumstances where you need to be safe or to opt out. But in general, the responsibility, and this was something that I said as we were looking at the playing for empathy style, is that you are responsible for yourself and for others. And so what does that look like, though, right? That may be actually counter to the way you behave outside of this game or the community that you're being part of. And so that has to be modeled, and it has to be backed up then by the organizers. So part of what John was saying was that you have to have a code of conduct and a way to do it, but it has to be practiced and enforced and believed in. There are a lot of places where they will say these certain things, but then when it actually comes into play, the community doesn't behave that way. And so these things are all bound up together, where they need to be modeled, they need to be shown, they need to be pervasive, and they need to have teeth, right? That the organizers have to actually, ultimately it comes to the organizers who begin to set and model these things, but also they end up with the hard calls sometimes, where things bubble up to them. So if it's going to be pervasive, and if you're going to have the more inclusive LARP that you want to have, and the more inclusive you are, the more opportunities you have to introduce more chaos into the system in a way, right? Because you begin to introduce more and more points of view and more needs and more things, and people who had been felt like they couldn't take part are now taking part, and so you've exponentialized the number of points of view, which I think is fantastic, but then also is more to take into consideration. So one of the things that we did in New World Magischola was an adaptation of a hand signal that Aaron Vanek and Kristen Hagelite came up with, which was a very quick way to check in with someone to find out if you're okay. And it was you flash them the okay symbol. And you can do that really discreetly, and the person would have to respond, and they couldn't respond back with okay, because that's an automaticity response, right? If somebody does this to you, you do it back, you don't necessarily know. They're just mimicking you, right? So you had to respond with an affirmative, I'm doing fine, right? Or I'm not doing well, but we know a lot of people don't often want to say I'm not doing well because of socialization. And so there was the middle hand, which is right, which you should sort of take as, okay, we're on the edge, or this, they really mean this, but they're not saying it. And so what would happen is you'd see people who were role-playing anger, or they're shouting, or sadness, or they'd be crying, and you couldn't be sure if they were okay or if it was actually role play. And rather than breaking their immersion or breaking the things you and to ask and to stop, or to leave them alone and abandon them if they actually needed help, you could flash them okay, and then you would sometimes get, then you get this and be like, oh, then you knew you were fine, you could move on. And then when you didn't get that they were fine, then that was a chance for you to enter into the situation and use some other techniques to make sure that people were doing, if they needed something. And then we had things built into the game, like counselor characters who were sort of meta characters, and Sarah played one of these, who you had an excuse to go to if you needed to, after you perhaps had to exit a scene, or if you came across someone who was or not not okay. And so you began to see this, and it was just a gesture that was simple and quick, but would cause immediate calibration at times. The other thing that we had was Largo, which sounds like a spell, right? But it's the musical term, right? That just means to go slow. And we use this instead of break, because Americans get very confused with break, in my opinion. They can't even decide whether it's B-R-A-K-E or B-R-E-A-K. And so whether that means to take a break, or I need a break, or stop, or whatever. So for us, when we just threw that one out and said, let's do Largo, which means back off the intensity, and we often would take a step backward and call Largo. And sometimes professors called Largo like a classroom management technique, which was interesting to see. But both of those were very, and I heard more Largo than because it was easier to call Largo than it is to call cut, because of that socialization that John was talking about earlier. So there's a couple of examples.
Awesome. And this, I think, can be considered a safety technique to a degree. We implemented a pronoun signal to correct pronouns. So it would be the British pronoun, or British P, and we would be able to verbally say pronouns as well. And that way, people from trans people or people from non-binary backgrounds could easily and seamlessly correct. And the default pronoun for the universe was they. There's been a lot of talk in communities about trans people having difficulty feeling comfortable in LARP communities where they are often very much the minority. And so that was, somewhat of a safety technique, really, if you think about it. And Johanna, you had a comment.
Yeah, I was just thinking now, because of these blockbuster type LARPs that New World Magic School is a really good example of, but also like in my professional, like our company also does some LARPs for different audiences where you, because now we're talking about sort of producing role-playing events for role players, right? But we're in the situation increasingly where we meet players who don't have a role-playing background at all, and it's made it quite visible how much implicit cultural knowledge we all carry. We're talking, like, we have been in this conversation quite focused on the different expectations of people with different LARP backgrounds, for instance, or different role-playing backgrounds, and that's a real thing, but that's like nothing compared to the confusion of people who will come in with like literally no understanding of what they've signed up for. And it's fantastic. And so there's a thing where you kind of have to, there for some players, a very small percentage typically, but you have to be able to say, what is role-playing? And like, here's this fiction, and well, while we're playing, we're staying in a character, and we're portraying, we're acting as though the fiction is real. And people have an intuitive understanding of this because of child's play and because of theater and because of all of these other cultural forms where you kind of understand role-taking. However, that does not mean that they will have an intuitive understanding of the distinction between player and character, and the very sort of excellent fluidity with which I think especially tabletop players, we have this, like if you're a tabletop player, you have this incredibly nuanced way to be able to drift in and out of character in a sentence, while playing. So you can do meta things, and you can do rules negotiation, and I roll my die and I talk to you about this thing, and I'm saying my character line, and I'm doing some body language, and then we can read that, we can read that as a language. We know what's the character stuff and what's not. That is also a skill that you need to learn, and role playing, in fact, is also a skill that you need to learn. And if you have players who aren't role players, and you might not even know if you don't ask people and sign up, have they ever done anything like this before? They might not have the conceptual toolkit to understand that that you need, like, the breaking fiction, being able to say off game or to do an out of character negotiation. So you might actually need, like, as a baseline safety thing, to introduce those terms. And the good thing about doing that is that all of the role players will take that for granted so much that they won't even notice that you're doing that. Like, their eyes will blank over with that page, or they will not hear even you say that, because they take it so for granted that they can't even understand that you would say that. But it's just as a reminder, this is quite important.
Can I piggyback on that really quick? Is that New World Magic School is one of those games where we had a lot of people who had never LARPed before. In fact, in the fourth run of the game, over half of our players had signed up for this, but were not LARPers. And what interestingly came to was that we were introducing these safety and calibration techniques for how to go off character. We realized we actually have to teach how to be in character, right? And so it is definitely the bespoke system that you're talking about, although there are certain things that should always be required, because what we realized is that they would go off character so much that they needed to actually be in character for the LARP. And so in the fourth run, I beefed up the NPC staff, and we were using NPCs to model role play and doing very specific types of run-in situations where they were being taught to role play, particularly on the Thursday night of the game, so that they could access it.
I would love to jump in and on the same topic that Johanna and Maury were just talking about. I was in New World Magic School Run 4, and it's exactly like Maury was saying. And when you're in those circumstances where you have so many people who are completely new to this and are having an amazing time but don't necessarily have the skills that we're discussing, it was interesting to watch that, because I've gamed with a lot of people who've never gamed before, but in smaller groups, so it's really easy to model behavior quickly. But when you're dealing with a scenario where you have 100+ people, that's a completely different situation. So one thing I saw repeatedly, because it was funny, a lot of us were talking in smaller Facebook groups, because a lot of players who had connections with each other were in Facebook, so they were constantly speaking their player thoughts on Facebook, so you get a sense of what was happening in game. And one of the things that would happen is you'd have one person who has a relationship in character with another person, and it's like an antagonistic relationship. Like, so their characters hate each other. So they would stay away from each other in game because they're like, oh, that person hates me. I should leave them alone. Every time I walk by them, they look at me like they want to hurt me or something. And what that led to happening is they wouldn't interact with that person, right? So even though they had this antagonistic relationship that is fruitful ground for amazing role-playing, in real life, if you see someone who's staring at you in that way, you stay away from them and you don't interact with them. But in the game, it's the opposite. It's the perfect opportunity to do so. So on the very last day, there were so many people who were saying, oh, I really, really wish we got to role-play more, but your character hated me so much, I figured I shouldn't come close to you. And that would be an example of a skill that is not obvious when you're dealing with a lot of new players.
And that's one of the skills, I'm sorry, that means that you have to be able to take risks. And in order to be able to take that risk means you have to begin to feel safe and to be able to have the calibration tools. So it's like we've come full circle.
And actually, that also means that you kind of, but it also means that you have to. But I mean, teaching people to role play is actually really important. That goes back to this thing about expectation management that we've also been talking about, because one is that how much are you allowed to, or expected to, or able to create content for yourself. There are a lot of LARPs and role playing games where you, as a player character, your job is to wait around for plots to come to you, and then like for an invitation. And a lot of other LARPs, like for instance the tradition that I'm from, you have to kind of like, the expectation is that you create the invitations, and the world is designed to react to you when you take initiative. But this is where what I was saying about at the very beginning, that we don't have enough words. Like we need that word for the antagonist as the story potential, or being late for class as an amazing opportunity to do something cool. Like that's like if you don't know what to do, maybe be late for class, because that's a story right there. And that thing, like that, we need better words to be able to explain what the expectation and culture we're going for in whatever specific LARP we're making is.
Oh, I would love to just jump in really quick. And in New World Magic School of 4, and probably other ones too, there was a thing that everyone was taught, which is if you're bored, get detention. So that was actually an area, it's exactly what you're talking about, which is anytime you weren't sure what to do, you were encouraged to get detention for any reason. And you could even go up to a teacher and say, hey, out of character, could you just come up with a reason to give me detention? And then you would go to detention and you would have a lot of fun.
Awesome. Great. So we have some questions. I totally would love to talk about using some of these tools in real life, which John has done in his life. And I know at least one player from New World Magischola is now in her workplace using the check-in signal with her coworkers who are non-LARPers, which I think is amazing. So let's look at Tara's question here. Tara Clapper asks, if a group of players wants to implement emotional safety in a cues in a LARP that has none, should they just do it? Are there negative consequences if the whole community hasn't opted in? And what if game runners don't think it's necessary and you do? Which is something that's coming up a lot in the conversations we're having after New World Magischola, actually. So it's a really good question. Thanks, Tara.
I have some ideas about that.
Yes, Lizzie. Please.
So I think that you have to tread carefully when there aren't emotional safety rules in a LARP, and you want to add them for a couple of reasons. One is that it can be embarrassing to the organizer if you try to bring it up too strongly in a workshop, for example. The other thing is that as a single player in a very big game, you are going to have trouble adding a rule, basically, because word really needs to get out. So when I encounter this situation, I prefer to exercise soft power. I might ask during the workshop, like, are there any emotional safety tools that we can use? So anyways, that's one example. Another example is that you can just do it yourself. So if you plot with somebody, you can step out of the game and negotiate with them. I think negotiation is a soft tool that's able to use. That's able to be used. But I think changing the entrenched culture, like in the moment, without necessarily a plan, is challenging, and that you've got to tread carefully.
I would even say that I'm a hardliner on this. I'm a hardliner on organizer power when it comes to design. I think never introduce something in a LARP that isn't there. There's a however that's going to come in a little while, but never introduce something in a LARP that isn't there, because you're actually you're not making it safer for anybody else. You're actually you're becoming less attentive to the norm system that is in place for the majority of the players. If there are sometimes, and I mean, I think you have to be generous enough to assume that the organizers have had some kind of idea, and if they don't have any kind of idea, like if they don't have any plan for anything, then you shouldn't play the LARP. Then it's a better strategy to, like, if you don't feel safe, don't play the LARP, like opt out. But actually, there are LARPs with intense content, and I've played some, and I've also been involved with organizing some where you decide against certain kinds of, like, band-aids and belts and suspenders, because you want to force people to be super attentive to each other at all times and to really, really listen. And that's a valid strategy. I think it's very helpful if the designer makes that choice to also tell the players. I'm a great believer in transparency, but sometimes they're not aware, and regardless whether they're aware of this stuff or not, that's actually the system they've put in place. And then you might actually undermine that by putting something else in. However, here's the however. There are probably, as Lizzie said, like, for instance, you can probably go out of character and negotiate. Like, the LARP probably allows all of, role-playing allows stepping out of character. And if there's not a specific word for it, you can say out of character, sorry, off game, I need to talk to you about this thing. And that is something that you can do. And there's a potential of social embarrassment if people don't want to step out of play, but like screw that. Like that's of course your safety comes first. But then you have to figure out if you don't want to opt out of play entirely, you can figure out like how do I inject safe behaviors within the existing structure, like without hacking the LARP that's here. There's one exception, which is that if it's actively dangerous and you try to intervene and you find that there's something like actively dangerous and harmful things are happening, and this is very important, not potentially dangerous, not someone might be triggered, like there might be, that's something else, but like something that's actually like not potentially harmful, but actually harmful is happening or about to happen, then all bets are off. Like then if they're being responsible, of course you have to act and break play and so on. But then the correct action is for all of the players to either opt out of the LARP at that point or to take over the running of the LARP at that point. And the social consequences will be enormous. And that's something that then have to be aware of, that probably there's a lot of bridges that are going to be burnt within that community. It's still the right thing to do in a situation which is actually dangerous, and you should do it. But I think don't hack somebody else's LARP. It's so rude, and it's also counterproductive.
Maury, do you have any ideas on this?
It's a really tough one because when you can build a community from the start, right, and get everyone on board with a new ethos and a new LARP, it's far, far, far easier than attempting to shift an entrenched culture, even if it's only a game that's been in existence for a year and a half, and some of these games have been in existence for a very long time. They are a leviathan, and it takes a massive amount of energy just to even get a nudge because LARPs are so distributed. I would argue that that part of what Lizzie is saying is that in small groups, if you have personal check-in things, Ben and I, when we play LARPs that don't have mechanics for check-in with each other anyway, just as co-LARPers. But I would think that there are some of these techniques and things that are being published now, and maybe there's some things that you can bring to the organizers of the game and sort of respectfully ask, in there are ways that you could begin with one and see about testing it or discussing the importance of it, and to show there's some evidence now of them working. Not that there hasn't been, but there's perhaps more evidence that may be a little more closer to the games that you're talking about. But it's a hard road to change a culture, and so I would say that you need to feel personally safe, and if ultimately you aren't feeling personally safe in the LARP, then maybe it's not the LARP for you.
But Maury, do you agree with me that like the workshop is not the time? Like even if you want to nudge the Leviathan, don't do it once because the LARP has started when everybody is on location. You maybe haven't started playing, but the LARP they designed is already on. Like do it before you even get there. That's
I would completely agree with you, because you're not going to be heard. I mean, you're at that point in the LARP, and it will be taken offensively. It won't be. It's not the right time to be heard, and you'll be also confusing.
Yes.
I just want to jump in and say that I have to run, but this was lovely, and thanks, Sarah, for having us, and thanks to all of the listeners for tuning in. See you all later.
Hi, Lizzie. So, John, did you have thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, mostly I'm going to reinforce what folks have said, but I'll do it very quickly and add one detail, which is I think you definitely want to contact the organizers in advance, right? Because using the workshops as an example, not only has a LARP started, but you might not be in a situation where you're practicing these techniques, right? So it's disruptive in the sense of usually these workshops are timed, right? I have 20 minutes for this, 10 minutes for that. Now imagine you're introducing new things, you don't have a way to teach it, you haven't practiced it, and as we talked about earlier, if you don't practice tools, sometimes it can even be worse in some situations. So I definitely say contact the organizers beforehand, give them examples, have a conversation with them. That all said, I think something you can do that's ad hoc that we have mentioned, but I want to reinforce, is have a buddy, right? So if this is a safety concern, always, do what you need for your own safety 100%. But additionally to that, let other folks know what your safety needs are. Get them to opt in and have a buddy with you, I would say is highly encouraging. The last thing I'll say on this is that, so I created the X-Card safety mechanic, which is very much a tool that's very much a hard stop, right? So when you use it, there's no questions asked, you edit the content and so on and so forth. I've seen people, actually let me take a step back. The talk in which you introduce that technique is more important than the technique itself often. So I've seen situations where people take this X card and in the middle of a game, there is no X card in this game, it's not been explained, and someone's having a bad time and they pull out their own X card, draw an X on it, and they're like, I'm now using the X card, they throw it in the middle of the table and no one knows what's going on. And it's a disaster. I've never heard that go well, so I just offer that as an example.
Awesome, and it sounds like Maury has to go soon, but there's one question that I think might be useful for us to try to address, and I'll have Maury answer first if she would like. And this is from Kate Hill. Kate asks, how do we encourage a culture of negotiation and safety when people are used to deciding things via mechanics? Emotions can be really strong and sometimes can make people unwilling to negotiate, even in games like New World Magiskola. So I think the question specifically is geared towards players who are used to having conflict resolution mechanics. And so it's difficult to negotiate if you've been planning to kill this character for 2 years and you finally get to that point and the person says, oh, I don't want to play that. Those kinds of situations make people very nervous. So Maury, do you have...
Yeah, that really sucks, doesn't it? When other people just don't do exactly what you want them to do, like when you can't control them like a puppet and they just, don't always just follow right along with your grand plans for the universe. These games are new for most people, for not all, but for many Americans. The games that they have played, either on the tabletop or in LARP, which in America came from Dungeons and Dragons, are very mechanics based, and they mitigate their risks and they take their power challenges because they feel certain. I know I have a 5 and you have a 4, and so I can go up to you and I can get the result that I want. And you with the 4, too bad for you. And so when you take those mechanics out of the game, like we did with New World Magiskola, like the Nordic games do, you no longer have player to mechanic, other player to mechanic, right? The mechanics are in the middle. Here you have player to player, and which is more the way the world works, although we do negotiate, of course, with laws and rules and other things. But those things those things always have what we might call mitigating circumstances or, additional information. And so the negotiation, even in a game with mechanics, still has to happen because we care about other people as people. And so your character might need to kill this someone, but if we're considering that is a player that is embodying that character, and that the results of the choices that you make, even though they may be allowed within the rules of the game, are detrimental to a person or to a community, those things should be considered. And too often we haven't, or we have not considered that, or we have actively tried to not consider that by saying it was my character, that was my alibi, or to say you're too sensitive, or you're metagaming, or you're doing all of these things that we have said. And so, but changing all that is really difficult. But I think you can have some negotiations. Some of that would have to happen out of game to be able to, in those kinds of games, to be able to talk about that. And I know, Sarah's done some work with the, with the community conflict, and a lot of that conflict often came from people, feeling like stuff was done to them, or people didn't consider, and the communities didn't always have ways to talk about that. So I don't know if that fully answered the question, but it maybe complicated it more.
Awesome. Thank you. Johanna?
Yeah, I think it's interesting because from my perspective, they are mechanics. So if you don't have point systems, and you don't have, you don't have hit points, and you don't have like skill points, you don't have XP, you don't have any of that stuff, and you don't have, so that means if you don't have those kinds of conflict negotiation systems in your LARPs, that doesn't mean you don't have rules. Like, you have tons of rules. You have these, we call them systems because they are systems, and it's not because like they're systems where we're like, feeling each other's vibes. Like, we're not mind readers. We absolutely need all kinds of rules for everything we do. So for me, like, a negotiation mechanic is a mechanic. And actually, because we're in this very interesting situation, we're coming to the Grand Masquerade in New Orleans next week to run a vampire LARP called End of the Line, which is in the sort of collaborative Nordic style, and quite physical, which of course in the tradition of vampire as Masquerade has been played, it's like you have to like literally the mechanics involve touching. And one of the reasons for that is that, like, it's not very dramatic touching, but to be able to use disciplines, for instance, you have to physically touch the other person to enforce focus and respect in that situation. But this means that we've had these interesting conversations about like how much, because we have to explain a lot of things that are implicitly like assumed in Europe or in the Nordic countries. And the wonderful thing about this is that when you have a player base that is really used to complex systems and a lot of rules, it's okay. Like, you can send a PDF that's a lot of pages and they will actually read what it says, because these are players who love rules. And these are players who are interested in systems and mechanics and interactions and how that works. And I love that, because for once, like, I come from a tradition where players would like ideally have almost no, like, the less rules and the less mechanics you have in a system, the cooler it is. But here you can actually introduce some pretty serious safety and calibration stuff, because people are used to handling like 50, 70 things that are happening slightly out of character or entirely out of character to even be able to play. So if you give them 12, they'll be like, this is fine. So no, I'm thinking like that this is actually less of a problem than it seems. You just have to conceptualize of these as systems. And if they don't work logically as systems, if they are not producing the kinds of results that you want them to do, then there's something wrong with your design. So everything needs to be tested, just like you would test a system, the maths of a mathematical system, of a percentage system. You have to test the outcomes on different kinds of players on your under other kinds of participation safety systems as well.
Awesome. John?
Johanna said so much that I wanted to say. In fact, I feel like I wrote down what my answers were going to be, and she just came in and just swooped it all. So obviously I agree with a lot of what's been said. I want to underline it is a mechanic, right? And sometimes you want to test your math. You also want to test your communication, right? So maybe it's a communication issue. So for example, and this goes back to this idea that we may not have the right words to communicate what we're doing. We may not have the right ways to practice what we're talking about. So it's an iterative process. So I would add to it that sometimes what people are saying may not be what they mean, but that's still useful information because it could be pointing to something that we can address. It might not be what the literal words they are saying, but it's useful data to gather and to look underneath. So for example, I've heard lots of people say, I don't like meta mechanics, who are, let's say, tabletop gamers, Dungeons and Dragons gamers, but they have no problem with hit points. Right, so you'll say, hey, I heard you really hate metagame mechanics. Like, what about hit points? And they're like, that's not a metagame mechanic. And then you list all the reasons why it is. And they're like, oh, wait, yeah, no, you're right, it is. And so that's an example where is something normalized or is something not normalized? Right, so once it's normalized, often they don't even think about it as a meta thing. It's just a thing that you do all the time. So that points to an example of practice and so forth. That said, it can be useful to make this clear beforehand. So sometimes negotiation is something that you negotiate before the game starts, right? So this might be an example of the kind of thing where really needs to be discussed in that level of detail before the game, depending on what we're talking about. Cool.
Awesome. Maury, did you want to stick around for the last question, or were you going to head out?
There's just the one more?
There's just the one more. Okay.
I can stay for that one.
All right, and it's from our buddy Jason Cox. Debriefing provides emotional support, separation from the game, and some space for reflection on the experience. As Johanna notes, however, words have limits. Has anyone used or designed or conceived methods for effective nonverbal tools for debriefing? Now, first, we should define debriefing, so I don't think we've actually done that, which is upsetting to me. But basically, after the game, having a structured discussion about the sorts of feelings that came up during the game, processing those things ritualistically before leaving the game space. And of course, debriefing can also happen informally, one-on-one with people, or it can happen at, after game events where people tell stories to each other. But I think we're specifically discussing structured debriefing here with Jason's question. Does anybody have any thoughts on that?
Yes, and I'd even say that the one part of it is the de-rolling, like in some way separating yourself from the character, and part is sort of processing you're integrating these experiences in some way, like organizing how the fictional experiences and the actual experiences that have happened in this fictional framework, how you're going to integrate them into your real world identity as which parts of it are going to count and which aren't. But there's also another part which is super important, which is the bit where we all figure out collectively, like, what was the story, what happened, like, what was this like, was it good, was it bad, what was the narrative, what was the overall story, because of course we've all had that little one part, our own part of it up until that point. And because so many things are going on, I think one thing that's really important to note relative to your question, Jason, is that people will have really different needs. Like some people, and people are also different, like players are different, and then they'll also, on top of that, will have had different experiences. Some people will need to hug everybody, and some people will need to not hug anybody. And already there, a lot of organized debrief design actually forces people into, like maybe they force people to talk a lot about their experience at the point where they need to be quiet and process. And sometimes quite often we have space and time constraints that make it very difficult to cater for that. But I think if it's possible at all, already when you're designing it, put in some time between the end of the game and the beginning of the formal debrief part of the thing. And it's good to have a level of transparency about what's going to happen, and to allow people to opt out of each exercise as they happen as well. And maybe to even verbalize that it's possible to have to have different needs. At a LARP where I was pretty recently, which was very intense, called Halat Hisar, which is a political game about occupation, and it includes torture, for instance. There was, for everybody who had been involved in playing torture, there was a separate debrief where we talked about that experience. But a big part of the debrief was that there was a big space, and there were these signs put up on different sides of the room, which was like hugging area, war story area, like different, and then there was you had a few hours where you could go to whichever area, like whatever you needed at that time. There would probably be somebody there that you could do that thing with at that time, and also I think that the organizers were keeping an eye out, so you could, like, if there was nobody there and you needed something, you could do that. Also, a ritual actually also used at Halat Hisar, but quite good, I think, to use in a lot of places, is that you have something like you let people take an object, part of the costume, for instance, that's associated with the character, and for instance, just everybody's in a big circle, and you go there and you give that object away, like you physically distance yourself with that thing from your character. And if you've played disgusting people, for instance, or very violent or horrible people, that's a very good thing to do. And in this particular case, they'd said you did that, and then you said one word, and it was limited to one word. Like you just whatever feeling or whatever you need, you get to express something verbally, but you just get that one word at that point, and that was the sort of entryway into the whole debrief. So those are a few things that are less verbal. That you can do. Yeah. Oh, also one thing more. Sorry, food and showers, super important. Like if like that's one of the easiest hacks you can do, is make sure that once everybody stops playing, the reason you know, like actually it's there to give people some processing time, but you pretend that it's because you want everybody to have a shower and a meal before the debrief starts. And that's going to force them to change out of their character clothes, and it's going to make them place them in their bodies, and they're going to be completely, you know, so much better by the time you get them for the debrief, and that's going to help out as well. Yes.
I've also heard cleaning up the site together before the debrief might be a useful one as well. Maury?
Yeah, I wanted to speak to some things that I've done in teaching in the humanities that I haven't yet gotten a chance to do in LARP debriefs, but that I'm very interested in doing, and that has to do with drawing and giving people just crayons or markers that they don't have to draw figures, because a lot of times people have trouble with, I'm a bad drawer, I'm a bad at art, but just their color choices that can represent emotions, using symbols and also music as ways for feeling emotions and accessing emotions, and using music to symbolize and managing the space. You know, like when we go to the theater, we leave the theater and it's clear when the thing is over, and so sort of ritualizing a departure. A lot of times we have a way into a LARP that is quite clear that you've entered the world, but we haven't paid as much attention in terms of exiting the world, and that can also be done with light and sound and music and art and other things. We've also, of course, written letters, which is still writing. It's still words, but it isn't on the spot. And so that's still processing verbally, but it's sort of an interim step towards some of these other ways that you can access emotions through art and music, which I would really like, and environmental, sort of the Edward de Bono kind of things that I would like to explore more with LARP. And with that, I'm going to have to go because my 10-year-old lost her tooth, and she's she's incredibly excited about this. And so thank you so much for having me and for letting me be part of this.
Hi. I would like to come in on this thing with music. It sounds like a super specific thing, but it's just that quite often in LARPs we use music inside the fiction. And I find, for instance, I've seen this many, many times in LARPs that, for instance, model like oppressive communities, or like you're in a military setting and you sing some certain, like, you know, those like military team building songs and whatever. And inside the fiction, it makes a perfect sense. But actually, even though they're actually like, you end up in this kind of weirdly fascist territory. And there's a thing that happens where the people who feel this strong community because of this LARP, they want to sing those songs. Or it could also just be like, in this village, we sing this song at the fire or whatever. They want to sing those songs out of character as well. And this might actually be, depending on the message of the LARP and depending on the context of that music, that might actually be a little bit destructive. So if you find that you're using songs that it would be counterproductive to also sing outside, then you need to decide the after LARP thing in a way where people don't sing those songs, like, for instance, because there's other music playing in the background. Sounds super specific, but this is a real thing.
And for LARPs that do have music soundtracks that are associated with that, hearing that song every time is super triggering of all of the emotions that are tied to that LARP. So sometimes it's good to have a really obscure song, actually. John, you had some comments.
Cool. So I have a lot of things that we've already covered, so I'll skip those in the interest of time. And I will state that I find this actually reinforces a lot of what we've been discussing, which is not just use words, but prove what you're saying, right? Show people that you're serious and that you mean it. So in that vein, I know that at the end of a debrief, a lot of times people will say, if you have any questions afterwards, feel free to contact me, so on and so forth. A nonverbal thing you can do to really reinforce that is actually hand them a business card or a card with your contact information, because it makes it very clear as you hand it to them, you have this connection. It's almost like they have a part of you that they take away, and you're reinforcing that you are being honest and clear that, yes, in fact, if you do need anything, I'm here for you.
I love that, and I definitely think that de-rolling buddies or debriefing buddies later is an excellent way, because people aren't always ready to process their emotions right after the LARP. So knowing that there's a lifeline after everybody leaves site. I would also suggest for people who are comfortable with it, physical touch, hugging, which I know we mentioned maybe having parts of the room where people can opt into hugging, which sounds great. But it can release actually oxytocin in the body and make you feel more trusting and more loved in general. So that can be really helpful. We do have one further question. The two of you would like to field it. Probably go faster with just a couple of us. Karen Edmond says, how does risk management or tolerance tie in with LARP safety? First from a designer perspective, then from a player perspective.
We just lost John, it turns out.
He may or may not pop in, but he's like the perfect person to answer this question.
Yeah, darn. John, if you can hear us, come back. I'm not entirely sure what that means. I read it to mean that. So the way I understand this, but this might be an English question. Sarah, maybe you can help me. But the way I understand it is that the more you focus on safety. Hi, John. Welcome back. I'm trying to parse this question.
We summoned you back.
Fantastic. So the question is, how does risk management / tolerance tie in with LARP safety from a designer perspective and from a player perspective? And the way I parse this question, which may not be right, is that when you focus on safety, like that there's a bar basically that you set for safety, that you keep moving by putting in safety design, for instance. So then like you would want risk. Sometimes you want certain behaviors, like you might want to encourage certain behaviors that are risky. So this is some kind of tension there between risk and safety. Do you guys read this the same way as I do?
I parse it very differently, which is hilarious given all the conversations we've had about words and meaning.
Yeah. Okay. What did you hear? Let's do that first.
I mean, there are all these approaches are valid. What I hear is, and this is probably very American, and just because I deal with a lot of contracts and insurance and all of these things, what I hear of is how much do organizers value risk management over safety rules and procedures. Like, so for example, I know a lot of organizations will simply refuse to use certain safety mechanics or certain code of conduct procedures because they're saying we are explicitly not responsible for all of these things, right? So I know that's a choice that a lot of different organizers make, and so I could be wrong as far as the intent of this question, but just quickly to address that intention, because I think it can be done so very quickly. Just like everything, I think it helps to be transparent and clear and honest, right? So if an organization simply is going to say, we are not responsible for X, Y, Z, and you are responsible for A, B, C, I think that that's subjective. And if I have that information up front, then I can make an informed decision if I want to be a part of that or not. So that's how I would address that. But being honest is critical.
So, but then that has to do with like risk management. So but then one of the risks that you would run as a LARP organizer in America is litigation, which is an almost entirely non-existent risk, I would say, in the Nordic countries. Certainly, it has been because we're not typically the entities that organize LARPs, so would not be organized as companies, as corporations.
And just because you're a corporation doesn't mean that you're free of liability or risk. There are lots of different ways in which...
I would say, in my understanding, if you're a corporation, it's easier to sue you than if you're like a club, for instance. Like if you're a role-playing society at a university, whatever. Like you're maybe the kinds of liability that are expected of you is like lower. But I think that, so I think it's very important to be very clear about what these tools can do and what they can't do. These are tools that will help you. They are not tools that will solve these things. Like you can have the best cut rules in the world, and if there's or like the best, you can have the best community in the world, but if there's a sexual predator there, for instance, like, or I don't know, or a psychopathic killer, like in theory, all those things could happen, or
a tornado.
Yeah, or a tornado. Like we can't make people safe, and there are definitely LARPs where where you actually put people in situations that are more dangerous or more risky or more emotionally risky than whatever they would be doing in their everyday lives. Most of us, like unless you're a fireman or something like that, probably you're going to be taking more risks just going into a forest, certainly, where I'm from, than you would going into an office. And that's just the way it is. Like that's just a fact of life. And if you make claims that having these safety procedures in place, or that's going to protect you from any kind of danger or harm, then you're being incredibly irresponsible, because then you're not allowing, then it's not a real opt-in. Then that opt-in isn't based on real information, right? So it's very important to be very, very transparent in what you can actually achieve. And then we're back at that problem with these things are quite hard to communicate. And the thing that always surprises people, they understand about bears and axes and all of that stuff, but the thing that really surprises people ultimately with role-playing, I think, is the emotional reactions. That emotional reactions, positive or negative, can be so strong. And I think that if you're a community, and I think we're at a very interesting point in the United States right now with these kinds of LARPs gaining traction, where many players are having this experience for the first time, that you can play a LARP that might even be, you can play New World Mediscola and it's a really positive experience, and at the end of it you feel a great sadness. And then you can feel like somebody else should have protected me from this sadness, because it wasn't something that you would normally expect to have after a positive experience, because you're thinking of a LARP more as like going to the movies or something like that, and less like going on to camp with your, or going on a on a gap year with your best friend or something like that. That you have an intense experience together, and when that ends, even if it's been great, because it's been great, you're going to be sad because it's not continuing, and your real life, may not be all that hot for most of us. We have some, there's always some stuff. Like there's, for instance, an office that you have to deal with, and yesterday I was a magician and today I'm not, and it doesn't mean that I have some kind of problem parsing that I'm not a magician. It's like, yeah, I'm not, and then I'm sad, and the purity of that emotional response can be quite surprising if you haven't felt it before. And I don't think it's possible to protect anyone. Like the purpose of LARP, the purpose of these kinds of LARP, in fact, is to open yourself to those kinds of experiences, and then no safety system and no calibration system will protect you from it. So that emotional risk, even like in an optimal scenario, like is always going to be present. But that's actually sort of a positive thing. Yeah.
So I have a different take on Karin's question, knowing her as I do. I think, and I could be wrong, but I think that she's also sort of getting at what sort of risks are we willing to take as communities and as organizers with regard to things like potential sexual harassment, with regard to things like alcohol consumption at the LARP, and to what degree is that a responsibility that should be embedded in the safety rules of the community.
Oh,
there's no such thing as one community, I think. But John made a lot of notes. So maybe, John, you say what's in your notes, and then I'll respond to what Sarah just said.
I have a lot of notes. But, I mean, so I would say, to reinforce what you're saying, there isn't one community, there isn't one culture, there isn't one experience, right? Like even I live in New York City, and there's 20 different LARP organizations, and they're all quite different from each other. So I think that there isn't necessarily any universal sense of responsibility or what you might expect, other than what is clearly stated, right? And if it's unclear, I think it is fair to follow up with the organizers and ask them for clarity. So for example, I think in the environment that we're currently at, because it's really easy to throw up a code of conduct onto a website, I think it is completely reasonable for anyone to contact an organization or a LARP or an event and say, hey, I see you have this code of conduct. If the following thing happens, it says to contact this person, well then what happens after that? Will my information be kept anonymous? Will you take action? What are examples of some places in which you would take action versus not? the question came up of alcohol. I know that that's actually a huge question in various American conventions because a lot of harassment that I'm aware of happens in the conventions themselves, but also happens outside of the conventions, right? When people go to hotels or go to bars afterwards and so on and so forth. So there's a question of if there's a sense of responsibility, or even if you have a code of conduct, what are the limits of that code of conduct? Do they still apply to when we all go to the bar together afterwards? What if the convention event is held in a hotel space? Do the hotel rooms themselves count as part of that space? What are the limits of this? And I think those are all things that are worth questioning. I wouldn't make any assumptions. I wouldn't trust anyone. Don't trust anything that's unsaid. Ask and get the information, and then make an informed choice.
Yeah, certainly don't guess and then then demand that somebody lives up to something that you've made up in your mind. Like, that is not fair to anyone.
Yeah, definitely. And I would love, so I don't want to change this, but you mentioned earlier, like, for example, nonprofit or clubs may be less liable than, let's say, corporations. That's very state-by-state dependent in the U.S. So, for example, in the U.S., there's some places where having a nonprofit, it is easier to sue you personally than it is if you have a for-profit. And one of the reasons why it's easier is because there's common mistakes that people take for granted that they make often that can be used to pierce the veil, right, which is the legal term, that takes away your protection from liability. So, for example, if you have a nonprofit and you don't keep your quarterly minutes properly, like you don't follow the specific template, that can be used to prove that you're not really a nonprofit, right? You're a fake nonprofit, and then we can come after each of these individuals personally. So that's another example. We shouldn't assume, we should find out, and every location, every state, every situation may be different.
Yeah. I'd like to return to what Sarah was saying. Everything you're saying is absolutely true, and this ties into directly. So, because there's not one community and there's not one kind of event or thing either, you have, like, the way you measure risk has to do with things like, what is the target audience of this thing that you're making? Is this open for everybody, or is it not? Like, is one of your goals that anybody can buy a ticket, and you would want anybody to be able to do that? Or does it require some LARP experience? Is it open for all ages or not? Will you mix people from different generations, or will you mix people from different experiences? And then also, like, what kind of a thing is this? Is this a convention? Is this a LARP? Is this a LARP product, as in, like, is this a LARP that's sold on some kind of open market ostensibly, or actually is it an educational setting? Like, all of those questions will of course set a completely different baseline for how much risk you're willing to tolerate. And some things that are very risky in some contexts are less risky in other contexts. And I think that because of the organic way that our communities have developed, we haven't been very great at distinguishing between these. So, for instance, when I started out, everybody was approximately the same age. I was maybe 17, and the people who were, like, really old were 24. And there's a big power difference between a 17-year-old and a 24-year-old. But of course, that's nothing compared to the power difference between a 17-year-old and a 44-year-old, or a 54-year-old. So we didn't, in the Nordic countries, for instance, set up, like, these really, in retrospect, really obvious social codes. Like, one, for instance, could be that if you're an organizer of a LARP, that actually gives you a lot of power. And I think this is a universal rule. Like, that's going to give you a lot of power, informal and formal power over your participants. And that means that you probably shouldn't be sleeping with any of your participants in the context of your LARP at all. And that, like, don't hit on them before, during, or after your event. And if they're a player in your campaign, like, don't get involved, or maybe they should stop if you do. And if you were running, like, if this was organized sports for young people or something like that, you would do it. And I'm not even saying it's just because, like, if I'm organizing, like, I'm almost 40 years old, and if I organize something for teenagers, obviously I shouldn't be sleeping with them, but that's true anyway. But even if all my players are my age, there's still this power difference that actually opens for dynamics that I might not be aware of, because obviously the person with the most privilege and power will be the most blind to their own privilege and power, and that's a real risk. And, like, those kinds of dynamics we haven't been very sophisticated in thinking about outside of our fictions, which is bizarre considering how great we are at writing all of these nuanced dramas about these exact things inside of our fictions. So it's been a rude wake-up call to a lot of us when it comes to that, which is that, of course, like I would say that if I organize a convention for people who are interested in my hobby, and that's, you know, or who are members of my communities, then I will have a very low tolerance of risk. And if I run a LARP for people who are, let's say, between 28 and 48 years of age, and it's a small group, and all the participants have the power of vetoing any other player if they don't trust them for any reason anonymously before the LARP starts, I'm going to be able to take a lot more risks with things like intimate interactions and alcohol during play, for instance, than I would do in another context. And I don't want to set any specific rules about this. But then again, transparency becomes key. Whatever you decide, the players have to be able to make active choices. And there's always a price with that you play relative to inclusiveness here, always.
John? Can you unmute, please?
Yes, thank you. Definitely. I agree that you have to look at the power differentials. You have to look at how the situation is going to alter people's perceptions of each other and how they might be able to influence each other. And this goes back a little bit to what we were saying earlier, where you can have two people who are in an antagonistic situation as characters in the game, and then afterwards they're like, oh, I wanted to interact with you, but I thought your character hated me, so then maybe you actually hate me. So then you have the situation where there's a bit of tension that comes from in the game that goes out of the game. But the opposite's true too. I've seen so many situations where people are like, we're such great friends in this game, it's so awesome, and then they try to be friends afterwards, and it doesn't work out, it's not great. And that's okay. That happens in all situations. But I think where it could be a little bit risky is this idea of trust. Like, I had this great shared experience with you, so now I trust you. Like, just because we had this shared great experience doesn't mean that someone's earned my trust.
That's a really good point.
And I think it's completely vital, actually, because you will feel the trust. Like, you will feel the trust for having these experiences. I would just say, add a specific physical example about risk. I was talking to a great designer, a very good safety thinker called Elin Dahlstål on Facebook earlier relative to my blog, and she said that so she makes these LARPs apparently that are can be quite physically demanding, something I wouldn't because I'm far too lazy. But like, for instance, if you have a LARP that involves your players actually physically climbing a mountain, you have, like, when you think about opt-in, opt-out design, that's a whole different ballpark, because like, if you're on the mountain, how the hell are you going to opt out of coming down off the mountain? And so and of course, like, there are some safety risks with that as well. If you're going to put some people on the mountain, they better be aware of the limits of the kind of safety that you can provide. And I've thought about this example so much because it's like the perfect metaphor for, like, where's the mountain? Like, what is the mountain? And it's like the mountain can be a social mountain, and that's maybe this is like my final word. It's like, you have to figure out, like, am I designing a game that will put players on mountains? And then I say that you can totally opt out, but they can't because they're on a mountain.
I like that. John, do you have a final word? Last line?
I love that. I'm just going to say that Johanna is amazing. So whatever Johanna said.
Agreed. All right, folks, obviously we love to geek out about this stuff and could probably go on for several more hours.
I have to say one thing.
Yes.
Sorry. I'm sorry. I have to say the name of the blog again. So it's participationsafety.wordpress.org. And one thing that I would love to do, very few posts from now, is to just, like, answer people's questions. So if anybody has any questions, they can post questions on the blog and get in touch with me that way. I would love that. Thank you.
Awesome. John, do you have a site you would like people to go to, or?
I will send it, and maybe we can post it underneath a video and so forth.
Awesome. Also, for those of you who are interested in the way that we designed the safety team, John was very instrumental in helping out with for Living Games. We have a Living Games documentation page that has the safety information. It also has links to the workshops that we mentioned earlier about basically training people for how to deal with crisis management in LARP communities. and it has some videos for talking about how to deal with policy and deliberation around codes of conduct. So there's an internal policy, there's an external policy, there's some thoughts from Lizzie Stark, who was on earlier, so it's a nice resource for you. So thank you very much for everybody who tuned in, and for the question and answer session was fantastic. And thanks to all our participants, including Lizzie and Maury, who aren't here, but also John and Johanna. Thank you so much.